What's good? What's good? YouTube, baseball in hand, logic in the other hand here. Yeah, thank you for keeping to view the videos. Thank you for the subscriptions. Thank you guys for all of that. Thank you for the comments too and the likes on the videos, all that stuff. And thank you for joining my Discord. I may or may not have the link in the description below, depending on how lazy I am. But so it's RIYOHA hashtag 6071. That's my Discord, so definitely add me on there. Maybe I'll post a link, we'll see. But yeah, so in this one I'm just gonna talk about, I've been learning a bunch of stuff basically thanks to YouTube and just my daily life experiences, which a lot of that happens to be centered around YouTube. So I've been learning a lot the past however many days or weeks here, or honestly especially days here. And basically it seems like anytime you have a centralized government, whether that be a monarchy, where there's a king or a queen or whatever, a centralized government like a communist or like a fascist kind of state, or honestly what other real centralized governments are there? Kings, queens, fascism, communism. Honestly, yeah. Like if you have any more examples of centralized governments, leave that in the comments below. But basically, anytime you have a structure like that where it's centralized, you're gonna have a few people that are very wealthy, and then the majority of people who aren't. A few people who get the benefits of that centralization, and a bunch of people that don't. And by its very nature, just think about it logically. Centralized power. How many people are in the center? Basically. And think about it this way. The United States right now, think about it, the center. How many people are in the center? Fewer and fewer people are in the center. Just think about it politically. Fewer and fewer people in the center, and more people push out to the margins. So you have a few people. Think about what used to be a moderate. It used to be that most people in the United States were moderates politically. Now most people are on the fringes, the outsides. So they're not even the fringes anymore, really. It's just like they're outside of center. These days most people are outside of center, and they're either on the far left or the far right. So that's how it is politically. Think about it economically. It used to be, at least in this country, that most people were in the middle class. Literally most people are in the middle class. That was the biggest class. Now, there's not really a middle class anymore. These days, it's most people are kind of poor, to be honest. In the United States, most people are in debt and poor, to be honest. And the people who are in the centralized power, so the government and the companies that work with the government have most of the economic power, and then a lot down from them. They have the way most economic power, and then down from that you have the people that work for the government, the bureaucrats, not the people who own the companies that work with the government. It's the people that work for the government. So the bureaucrats, the people who have government jobs, they're the second class. That makes sense. These days they're the second class. So they have money that's guaranteed by the government. So as long as they follow what the centralized powers say, they're guaranteed their salaries. So they have money guaranteed by the government. So at least they have guaranteed income, if that makes sense. And then you have everybody else who doesn't work for the government, doesn't own a company that works with the government or isn't part of the government itself, meaning a senator, a representative, a like Federal Reserve worker, like people that don't have federal work, and that actually represents the majority of people like in the country. And that's why a lot of those people, they either move to the far left or the far right. And then the far left and far right, they all have the same gripes, to be honest, the way that they talk. Like you could see two people and they would talk the same way when they talk about the problems of whatever, like the country that they're in. Let's just take the United States because I live here. They would say the same things when they talk about the problems, but then when they talk about the solutions, then it's different. So that's how you can tell if they're on the far left or far right. They all talk about how the current government is corrupt, how all these social ills are happening, and the people in power suck. But then if you're on the far left, you're like, okay, let's make a new government like that we're in charge. And then if you're on the far right, actually ironically, if you're on like the far right, like if you're like a fascist, you're like, okay, let's make a new government and we're in charge. But like if you're on, like if you're not that far, so if you're not like a fascist necessarily, you kind of say, okay, let's just have a smaller government. Like that's what most kind of people on the right, they say, let's just have a smaller government. People on the left, they're like, let's have a government when we're in charge. And like, let's distribute the economic power to everybody. And then if you're on the right, not necessarily the far right, but the right, you're like, let's just let everybody do their own thing. And like, over time, however economic power allocates is just, like, it's just the way that it is, basically. So they're like, let's just have free markets, and however it ends up, it just ends, like, depending on how hard you work, etc., etc. So, yeah, but to be honest, I kind of place, like, I know people that do believe in fascism, they watch this channel, but I kind of place fascism in the category of centralized governments, because yeah, let's just take Hitler's Germany, for example, because that's like the prime example of fascism. In Hitler's Germany, by the end of that, most of their resources were like going to military, and then they had to go and make war with other places because they didn't have enough resources for themselves. Like at first they started going to war with places to make up for their losses from World War One. That was like how it started at first. But then over time, throughout that war, they actually started losing resources. Maybe it's because you could argue maybe it's because they were too quick in like trying to take over places. But maybe it was because like that maybe that's just the nature of a fascist government, because if you have all the resources going to military, eventually your people are going to like not have resources for themselves. So then they started invading Russia for oil. They started doing different things, like they needed food from other places. And I don't know the whole history of that, so like leave that in the comments if you like know more than me. But like I do know that their own people didn't have enough for themselves by the end of it. Like, and then the military was like eating up resources like nuts. So there's that, like, and then obviously on the left we all know the problems that come along with that. Like you could just look at Russia, you could look at Cuba right now, you could look at North Korea, you could look at, like, we have honestly more examples of like far left big governments than like kind of far right big governments. Unless you want to talk about, see that there's a trash truck coming if you hear that on the recording here, but unless you want to call like monarchies far right, I'm not sure where you would put that. in the whole thing, but like to me, I just kind of categorize all of them as centralized governments. And I was watching a documentary about, I forget what the country, I don't know if it's Burma. It starts with a B, but it's a country in the middle of India and China. It's like in the middle of, like, landlocked there between India and China. And they have like around 800,000 people is their population. And the leader, the government there said, okay, they didn't like how gross domestic product and all this stuff was kind of the calculation of how well a country was doing. So then they made their general national calculation of how the country was doing. They made it the gross national happiness, or whatever they called it. It was like gross national happiness, where they wanted to measure the happiness of their country as like a metric to determine how well the country was doing. And like that sounds great, right? But then you realize, as I watched the documentary, I was like, what is up with this? And then like, I don't know, 10 minutes in, they said that the king and queen, they had a line that was like, and you're reminded of the king and queen's power everywhere you go. Like they literally had posters of the king and queen, like everywhere you went, basically. And then they had like cameras that like documented how many like posters that they were seeing as they were going around. And like, I was like, wow. And then they start going more and more into how the country's doing, and it turns out the majority of people are poor, lo and behold. Like the majority of people are poor, and the majority of people have like little political power, little economic power, and some people are starving and going hungry on the streets. And I'm just like, okay, wow, gross national happiness is like a centralized metric, and then all of a sudden you realize, okay, so there's a king there, and most people are starving. Like, it's just clockwork. Anytime you have a centralized power like that, I'm still trying to determine, like, as I'm doing my, you could call it research, like watching all, like, looking at different countries around the world from my computer screen, right? I don't live there. I just live in the US. But every time this power is centralized, it just eventually you just find that the majority of people are poor. Like, why is that? Like, the majority of people are poor, little political power, little economic power, and honestly little social power even. Like, they just lose their power because all the power goes to the center. They give all their resources to the center, and then you go around and all these people, they're like, oh, I'm glad that at least some of the people, not everybody, actually, they interviewed some people, and there were a lot of people that were just completely skeptical of the government. They're like, gross national happiness, what does that mean? So honestly, I applaud those people, but like when you're suffering that much at that point, you're just like, screw it, you know? But so it's like honestly even sad that it came to that point, but you had some people that were happy. They're not happy, but they were praising the king. They're like, I'm glad the king shows us all this mercy and all this bullshit. Like, I'm glad he shows us mercy. The hell is that? And then the king was like, he was basically God. So the king he was keeping up a perception of how he was God. Like, I mean, now we're talking about like pharaohs of Egypt and stuff. Like, this is, see, and even in Egypt, the most people were probably poor. Like, I was watching a documentary on the History Channel about that. Like, most of those people were poor. And then all those statues and like all the shit that they erected for the kings, most people just worked for the centralized government. Most people were poor. And then the pharaoh was apparently descended from God, and everything, like, he had to make, he all the decisions were in his hands and all this shit. Like, he had the power to wage war. He had the power to set laws and do all that shit. So honestly, it is what it is. And in the United States today, it's like getting to that point where the government's gotten so big. On the left side of it, the government's gotten so big, and then now the right side of it seems to want like one supreme ruler, which might be Trump, who knows. or a younger version of Trump as we get farther along this path. There might be a younger version of Trump. But basically, like now the right, they want like one centralized ruler. And then the left, they want one centralized government. Like, that's just how it is. And like all our taxes are paid to that central power. All our power we give to that central power. And like, to be honest, I kind of disagree with that, which is why I'm posting YouTube videos almost every day. Because I don't really want to work for the government and that centralized power. And then also, on the other side of it, I don't really want to back like one centralized ruler either. So I'm just trying to, the channel's called An Essential Business. I'm honestly trying to like just grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers once so I can make money. And then also just share my perspective and see what you guys think, because a lot of you guys that watch this are in America. I just want to know what you guys think about the trajectory we're going on. And then you guys who are watching from other countries, I'd love to know like how your countries are doing, because it seems like this centralized power shit is going on in a lot of places. And a lot of it comes down to like centralized banking, which I've got into in other videos, and I'll get into it in later videos. This video is getting long enough, so like I won't get too much into it here. But centralized banking, when you start centralizing the economics and you like abstract all of like what value is, then like people get confused, and then people get scared, and then they want to place their power in the centralized entity because they're scared at that point. Like the way that central banks just abstract the value of an economy is honestly like that is admirable, like in a sense, not admirable and like that I think it's good. It's just admirable that they can really keep that kind of just like lying going, if that makes sense. Like that kind of just non-choose, the fact that they can keep that going is like admirable is probably the wrong word. It's like impressive. I think impressive is the word, because that doesn't denote good or bad. It just means that it's impressive. The fact that they can keep those, I don't even know what you want to call it. They just keep that kind of system going, and even like they're doubling down on the system, and they haven't had. We're seeing spurts of revolting here and there, but there hasn't been that's like basically everyone revolting yet. The fact that they could stop, maybe it's obviously because of coercive power, right? Like here in the United States, if you're watching this from a different country, the government and then our central bank, they work together. They're technically supposed to be separate, but they work together. And probably it's because our government has a monopoly on violence. That's probably why they're keeping it more under wraps, more so. But like you're just seeing spurts of revolting go on here and there, like on both sides, left and the right. So yeah, I don't know how I don't know how much they can keep the system going, because like the reason why the average person isn't aware of this, one, it's because they don't have like that person doesn't have any means of, like the average person in the US doesn't really have any means for violence, especially where I am in California. Most people just simply don't have means for violence. So there's that. But then on top of that, the complexity of the system. Most people also, they simply don't understand how it works. And it takes years to like begin to grasp how it works. Like I've been working on this, technically you could say, since high school. I'm 24 years old now, and since high school I started on the path of trying to understand it. Granted, back then, for the first couple years of my research, you could call it, I just thought it was Illuminati. I was like, oh, Rothschilds, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, basically any conspiratorial group you could think of, I thought they were behind all the bullshit. And over the years I started breaking down how it actually worked. And now I realize, okay, it's not necessarily the Illuminati or whatever. Like there's a way that the whole thing works. And yeah, people profit off of it, like Bill Gates, for example, who actually I don't have too much hate on for some reason. and I'll explain that in later videos, but like people profit off of it and they get very wealthy, and then but most people, one of the reasons I don't hate on Bill Gates is because that dude, he took the time to understand it. Like he took basically years to try to understand it, and that was like just after they got off the gold standard. So he probably saw all this stuff in real time, and like he was probably like, holy shit, I can't believe this. And then he was trying to tell people about it for years and nobody listened to him. So then he just went off and did shit by himself. That's the garbage truck going on. Like, so that's why I don't necessarily hate on the guy, because he was trying to tell people about this stuff for years and then no one listened to him, so then he just went off by himself. That's honestly the kind of position I find myself in, and that's why I'm posting so many YouTube videos. But that's why I'll explain that in other videos, like the whole Bill Gates thing. But it is what it is. The complexity of the system is one of the reasons why people don't just completely overthrow that stuff. It's only when they start realizing, okay, I can't even buy food anymore, that's when most people start caring. But it is what it is, man. Like, we might as well just keep watching this as it goes along. I'm hoping that, like, at this point, now that I've spent so much time understanding it, and like now I'm basically just trying to take advantage of it, will it collapse? I don't know. Whether it collapses or not, I honestly don't really have a stake in it. Like, I'm just gonna try to capitalize on it either way, because I've tried to tell people, most people just don't, like, they understand, okay, like, this isn't really, this is like kind of corrupt, but then they don't take the time to understand it and they just go about their day. So if it collapses on them, I'm just like gonna try to like make myself good, and like I'll just say, hey man, I try to tell you. And if it doesn't collapse, I'm just gonna try to capitalize on it at this point. Like, it is what it is, man. And hopefully you guys follow me. Any black pilled people you know, send them to this channel, because we're just all gonna try to capitalize on it here. But yeah, that's basically it for this video. I will catch you later. Have a good day. Hopefully it's sunny where you are, and peace out, guys.